Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today to talk with you at the Humanities Festival. It's nice to hear that people still want to go to talks about the humanities. We're, of course, in a crisis, but I think that we have a unique perspective on how society is organized and what can be done about its problems. And that's exactly why I wrote Borrow and Debtor Nation, to help understand and put in perspective what debt means today. I mean, after all, we're often told that the causes of our current indebtedness are cultural. They are our own moral failings. America has lost its way, what with the sexual revolution, the breakdown of the family, the loss of work ethic, and all these kinds of cultural factors that make us immoral and make us debtors and make us deserve what we have gotten. But the debt relation is a two-sided one. For a loan to happen, you need a borrower, but you also need a lender. And what I've tried to do in these books is understand the intersection of finance and the habits of culture that shape this lending, that give us a window into what is the same and what is different about borrowing today. Now, I started working on this stuff about a decade ago when everybody thought it was boring. It was a time when the really hot topics were the history of the body. And of course, many still think that it's boring today. But unfortunately, I think recent events have made it interesting again. And so I'd like to start us off with a story. Because after all, this is history, and that's what we like to do. We like to tell stories. But I think the story will clarify exactly how much has changed. I'd like to tell you a story of the recent past, a past in the midst of financial crisis, one that should be all too familiar to you now. Now, of course, I have to change the names to Dick and Jane Smith because you don't want to be mixed up in the historian's accounts. But like most good stories, this story is what they should all be about love and about hope. And so the story of Dick and Jane is the story of love and hope, of two young people meeting after they moved to the big city. Sparks flew, declarations of love were exchanged. Then you have rings and vows, and then came that next necessary step for a love to be true, to own a home of your own. Now, he didn't have a college degree, but Dick had recently found work in the hottest new high-tech industry in town that was sweeping the country. In fact, that company's IPO, initial public offering, a few years back had been the most successful in US history. And so Dick and Jane, like everybody else, were caught up in the optimism. Were caught up in what newspaper pundits called a new era. Everything would just keep getting better. Now, they had a lot of love, but they didn't have a lot of cash. And so they went to their local bank to find out if they could get a mortgage. And they sat down with the mortgage officer, and he did a few calculations. And he told them that an amortized mortgage, where they paid off their debt and the interest every single month, would not get them the house they wanted. Dick just didn't make enough money. But not to worry. There was another option. He told them, another option that all the smart people were doing today, something called a balloon mortgage, interest-only mortgage, where you didn't worry about paying off that debt. Why? Because in a few years, you're going to sell it, and house prices are just going to keep going up. And if you had to refinance a few years down the road, it wouldn't be a problem. They just come right back to that mortgage officer, and he'd be there for them. And so they were so excited. Dick went to work, they moved into their house, and Jane filled the house with contemporary, fashionable furniture that they bought on the installment plan. And so while she bought a sofa, he could buy a Chevy. All this is made possible by debt. Now, his father had only ever paid cash, but he got a loan. And though they didn't have any savings, they could count on Dick's steady job in that high-tech future. Everything was working out. I mean, after all, it was 1928. What could go wrong? 1929 would only be better. And so the parallels between Dick's manufacturing job at General Motors in Flint, Michigan, and today are a little unsettling. And perhaps even the larger structural similarities between the 1920s and today are absolutely terrifying. What has changed? Well, a lot has changed, but not exactly as you might think. In the past few years, Occupy and other kinds of organizations have brought us back to being aware of the inequality in American society. And it's in this that we are very similar to the 1920s. In the 1920s, credit fueled the economy, making it possible for working class and middle class people to take part in all the modern conveniences, like vacuum cleaners. And these kinds of things were instrumental in the expansion of the manufacturing economy, driven by electrical goods, driven by cars and vacuum cleaners and all those other modern miracles. And even in the 1920s, we see things that we think we just had recently invented. New kinds of financial instruments like car loans or the mortgage bond. This is how that mortgage officer was able to offer them that easy way to buy their home, because he knew that he could actually just sell it, not the loan itself, but sell a bond and use it to pay for their mortgage. And just like now, people use credit to live beyond their means. And in the last 100 years, this inequality has peaked in 2 years, 1928 and 1927. It's no coincidence that our highest eras of inequality have coincided with the eras of excess lending, when in the 1920s, all this new kinds of mass production was made possible by mass consumption. And to pay for all those goods, you need one of two things. You either need wages or you need credit. See, economics isn't that complex. It's not as complex as they make it out to be. It's very straightforward. You need credit or you need wages. But while credit can substitute for wages in the short run, eventually the bills need to be paid. And American workers have not been paid in a very long time. You can see in this graph how there was a tremendous boom in wages throughout the post-war period. In just 16 years, real wages, that is, wages that are adjusted for inflation, grew by 47%. There's a reason why they could borrow all that money and pay it back. Their wages were going up. Meanwhile, since 1969, wages have gone down about 5% on average for average people. Now, this doesn't mean that the economy wasn't growing. In fact, the economy grew tremendously over this period. It just went to a very few people. And this kind of data, just a very few years ago, 5 years ago, was very controversial. If I gave this talk in 2007, which I did, a version of it anyway, at Harvard Business School, the crowd erupted in controversy. No one could believe that the GDP could go up like that while wages had stagnated. And yet, it's true. It's true. And nowadays, it's almost intuitive. But the next graph I'm going to show you, and I promise this isn't going to be a math presentation. We're at the Humanities Festival. But a little bit of math goes a long way, all right? It's not either or. Let's just do a little bit of math, all right? And I promise I'll stop. This next bit of math really explains it. What if our wages had continued to grow as they had in the post-war? What if instead today of having a median male wage of $32,000, the median wage in America was 60 grand? That's what it was like to live in the post-war. A median wage of 60 grand. It's a tremendously different world, almost double, and certainly inconceivable to us today. And in that gap were all these ways to borrow. as the economy stalled out, as people no longer were able to earn those post-war wages. They turned to other ways. And so there are stunning similarities: a dead-end housing boom, economic inequality, and most importantly, I would argue, a need to find a place to profitably invest all your money when you're at that top. And so rather than this being a borrower problem, I would argue, it's an investor problem. It's a lender problem. All that money trying to find its way into good investments ends up in consumer debt, which produces no real long-term growth and doesn't make the economy any bigger in the long run. And so what we need to understand is not just what is the same, but what is different about the 1920s and today. And in fact, a lot is different between those two moments. We've had a lot of experiences in policy, a lot of experiences certainly in shopping. So let's consider this world institutionally. And after all, this is a humanities festival, so why don't we just look at a picture? Because a picture, more than any graph, this picture I'm going to show you from the late 19th century, will tell us much more than any graph. If you felt your soul being deadened by all those graphs, I want you to think about this picture and where it might have hung in a shop. I sold on credit. I sold in cash. Now, this picture would have hung in a small shop, maybe a grocer's. It's a chromolithograph from the late 19th century. And its entire purpose was that if I were in a shop and you came to me and you said, "Lou, I don't want to pay my bill right now. Put it on my tab," I would say, and I'd point at this on the wall. And you would know exactly what I meant. I didn't want to lend you money. And yet its picture, its logic, is from a very particular set of institutional and economic relationships. And if we understand this picture, we can understand not just a stupid number, but the entire structure of our society and how it's changed since the late 19th century. Embedded in this picture, we can see a world that is opposite from ours. A world where the guy who sells on credit is nervous and skinny. He's lost his hair, which apparently is not a good thing. I don't know. I like to think it is. But apparently it's not. And you look at him, and I don't know if you can see in the back, but his knees have patches. There's little rats scurrying around. He's worried that his coffers are empty. And on the other side, you have a corpulent man, a prosperous man who sells in cash. Look at those mutton chops. They're the envy of Williamsburg hipsters. Hipsters in St. Louis, I'm sure as well, would love to have chops like that. Look at those. He's got a nice rug. You know, if you look in the top right in his coffer, he has bags of money. Bags of money in any situation, this is an ahistorical truth, are good. Big bags of money. So what's the difference between these two men? One sold on credit, one sold on cash. The difference is that when they lent money to their customers, it was their own money. It was their money they were putting on the street. It was their money they had to collect. It was their money that was not invested in their merchandise or business or anything else. And when you look at these two men, you know that immediately. Those big piles of IOUs that are unpaid, fit only to feed rats on the floor, are the source of that man's anxiety, not tenure. Now, this is the difference. How do you move from a world where debt is not resold? Debt is isolated from the movement of money in society, as it is not today. This is not a world where loans are commodities. This is not a world where businesses thought of consumer debt as a good investment. I want you to think about that for a second while I sip this coffee that is no doubt illegal in this very nice room. What does it mean to say you're investing in debt? It means to say, this is a good use of my dollar. A dollar put there will make more than a dollar put somewhere else. Consumer debt was a way to lose money in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And what began to change, especially after World War I into the 1920s, what begins to make possible that world of Dick and Jane is that debt begins to be able to be resold. At first, for very specific things. Finance companies get set up that will buy debts from, at first, auto companies, car dealerships, and then, of course, Hoover. And in this moment, debt becomes profitable. Debt becomes a way you can make at least some amount of money, a reasonable amount of money. Now, everyone doesn't rush into this. It's not the case that our largest corporations thought this was a great idea, but it is something that can happen. It allows cash to flow around. It allows people to borrow than they could ever before. Yet, I'd like you to consider a moment. This is the inversion of that. That's my handy graphic. Okay. Consider a moment before debt could be traded everywhere in global markets like it is today, and yet still in a world that is legible to us as contemporary. I want you to think about the 1950s. The 1950s, in the midst of the post-war prosperity. Consider the adventures of one Joseph Miraglia, who worked as a $73 a week clerk on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And his story illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of what consumer credit means in an economy where debt can be resold, but just in a very, very limited fashion, opening up the possibilities of borrowing. Now, it all began in 1959, right after Joe was walking down the street and suddenly there was a downpour of rain. And so he ducks into a very, very fancy New York restaurant where he could not afford to eat. But he sees there, lying there, applications for these new kind of things called credit cards. In fact, these things called travel and entertainment credit cards. And they said right on the front that they were cards for, quote, men of responsibility. Obviously, Joseph thought it meant him. But he also thought it was kind of funny because he was an underpaid clerk. But he fills out the application, and this one turns out to be for Hilton Hotel's carte blanche card. And he fills it out. He's honest. He says, I make $73 a week. Now, to his surprise, as he's living with his parents still, he receives a card in the mail that told him it was, quote, this card is your key to every luxury Hilton has to offer. You could imagine his excitement. Because it turned out it actually was the key to every luxury. In fact, it began later that day at the Waldorf in Manhattan. But that kind of luxury was not enough for our man Miraglia. He then went to Montreal, where he stayed in a Hilton hotel, and then to Vegas, and then my personal favorite, Havana, before he finally ran out of steam. In fact, in just 1 month, presumably after he quit his clerk job, he ran up an orgiastic spending bill of $10,000. And this is in 1959. You could get a house for that. And so he did this across 3 countries, 4 girlfriends, and, of course, 1 rhinestone-colored Cocker Spaniel. The collar is something to be impressed by. He bought fur coats, he bought fine wines, he bought dogs, meals, suits. He even, at the Waldorf, got silk shirts from the same tailor as Cary Grant. This is quite a spree. And through all of it, he had only the cash that he had won at the Vegas craps tables and some checks he wrote against the card. And yet he lived, as he said, like a millionaire's son. When the police caught up with him, and they caught up with him. He simply said, I wanted to see the world, and I like nice things. But while Joe could live the high life on his carte blanche card, he couldn't live a normal life. And for me, this is one of the key distinctions. A traveling businessman with a carte blanche could eat in a few swank restaurants. He could buy his wife, or maybe his mistress, a fur coat in an affiliated shop. He could even get a suit from a neighborhood tailor. But he couldn't go to Kmart. He couldn't buy groceries. He could only go to places that catered to the expense account set. And for everything else, there was cash. Yet while Joe could spend 10 grand to live like a millionaire, it would have been nearly impossible for him to spend 10 grand to live like a middle-class person, much less a working-class guy from the Lower East Side. This kind of debt did not flow through to everyone. This kind of debt was not used for all things. This kind of debt was for the very few and for those people investing in very particular kinds of investments or purchases, like houses and cars. The way we use credit cards today, paying for groceries and fast food and probably this coffee, was heralded as futuristic in the 1960s. It was a hallmark of a wonderful, cashless world of tomorrow. It even had sex appeal, and it did because it was associated with the well-to-do. Men who used credit cards were disproportionately affluent, urbane, and they agreed, according to surveys at the time, with statements like, I like to think I am a bit of a swinger. Yes, the 60s. Yeah, those who opposed them believed instead, and this gives you the sense of the cultural meaning of debt, the cultural meaning of credit, and the way it intersects class and culture. Those who opposed credit cards instead thought that, quote, liquor is a curse on American life, that a woman's place is in the home, and the part that I like best, that hippies should be drafted. And so it's a totally different world. And the meanings of that debt were different, both in terms of institutions and access and everything else about them. It would be a distributed landscape of credit, where cards replace cash, that everyone and everyone and everyone could have access to them, not just at a few swank restaurants, but at all retailers, and for everyone, more or less, to have access to credit. But one of the reasons that this vision of the future seemed so impossible was because of the very real technological and financial limits on where credit could be used, and the moral limits to where it could be used, and how it could actually be sold to investors, not just finance companies, but to get access to the big money players in capitalism. Now, for Miraglia, for those of you who are very worried about him, he was actually let off in 1959. Yeah, because you're the very first person to do this, they cut you some slack. I mean, the judge considered these to be evidently youthful indiscretions. But like everything else with post-war credit, it portended things to come. It was the happy version of darker things. Because once you start using credit, it was hard to stop, especially when the assumption behind that credit, that wages will continue to rise as they had and would continue to do, when that key assumption about wages fell apart. In 1984, Joseph Miraglia perpetrated what the New York Times called, quote, the largest credit card counterfeiting ring ever encountered in the New York metropolitan area. And then he got no slack. Then he got a year and a half in federal prison. And I remain unable to find in the archive how that affected his credit rating. Now, what was different by the 1980s, when Miraglia did go to jail, was that consumer debt as a site of investment had begun to explode. When it had become something different, that the largest firms, the largest sources of capital, the banks and the pension funds, everything else, managed to start to invest in making sure that everybody got credit, like Miraglia. And it's this transformation, the transformation where companies like General Electric begin to back all those debts, that America and its economy really begin to change. Not just in terms of borrowing, but in terms of lending. And in terms of choices about what that means with the direction of the economy. By the end of the 1960s, General Electric Credit Corporation had existed since the 30s. It had been a place where GE helped the sales of its manufacturing arm. They would provide installment credit, dealer credit, all that stuff. But the real big money in GE was in making things, manufacturing things. It was where, if you went to GECC, it was where your career went to die, basically. But this changed in the 60s as GE managed to realize that they could sell bonds on the open market and use that to invest in consumer credit. And GE begins to do this in the early 1960s. They sell bonds for which they pay 5%, and then they charge their customers 20%. And when you have a spread like that, you start to pump as much money as you can. They begin to back not only their customers, but those of other kinds of retailers, becoming private label creditors. By the end of the 1960s, they were financing 1 in 25 households. And so these big banks, these big corporations, begin to figure out ways to sell bonds and then to lend money to customers. But they didn't directly sell customers' debts. They didn't actually begin to do that yet. But this had a huge effect, because every dollar that was invested by GE in a consumer debt was a dollar that was not invested in a GE factory. And the end of this came in the end of the 1960s as well, something called securitization, something that allows you to bundle up all those debts and sell them as a bond directly into the markets. Because in that moment, with securitization, the coffers of the skinny man and the fat man that I showed you before become limitless. It's not their money being sold. They're just middlemen. All the world became middlemen, and capital could flow directly from those markets into the hands of those who wanted it. Now, it began as something well-intentioned. All those mortgage bonds I told you about in the 1920s, those had been banned by the Federal Reserve since the 1930s. Those had come crashing down around the heads of people in the Great Depression. So they didn't exist until 1968 with the Housing Act. And this Housing Act brought back mortgage-backed securities. Now, this is a Humanities festival, so how can we interpret this document? It's not very difficult to interpret at all, but it is necessary. Now, this is from Mortgage Banker magazine, which I encourage none of you to read. It is an advertisement from, I've done the work for you, from 1969. This is where all those mortgages were intended to go. Ghetto ready, ghetto set, go, through the FHA. But very quickly, this idea of channeling credit into the cities, where for generations, mostly African Americans had not been able to get mortgages and destroyed neighborhoods. Quickly, that was eclipsed by the larger possibilities of this newly created mortgage-backed security, brought to you by the people on Wall Street in conjunction with those in Washington. And it's this combination of the mortgage-backed security with this now habituated population to borrowing that begins to spell trouble. Because it starts with them. It starts with just houses. It starts with just enabling investment. And by the mid-1970s, this was a huge portion of all the mortgage capital that was available. But then it begins to be something else. The gnomes get involved. And by the gnomes, I mean gnomes. This is an ad from Freddie Mac from 1984. And it's a very strange ad, and I think it explains everything that's gone wrong, where the official slogan of Freddie Mac was the gnomes know. You can see right at the bottom. And that right there is the CFO of Freddie Mac getting his instructions from the Keebler elves. I mean, this is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. When you look at that, you realize actually nobody understood what the hell they were up to. And it's in this ad that they advertise something called a collateralized mortgage obligation, just another of these ways to bundle up consumer debt and resell it to capital markets. How could one company start an industry that is Freddie Mac? Well, we've had some help. The gnomes of the secondary mortgage market, our omniscient associates. That is how they did it, by creating markets through these quasi-public corporations, creating markets for these kinds of debts, creating new investment vehicles to channel money, in this case, not into federally insured mortgages, but into all mortgages through the help of the gnomes. Now, obviously, there weren't really gnomes. Now, it's this possibility of channeling the ease of this investment in consumer debt that really begins to eat at the core of the American economy. Because the easier and easier it is to invest in consumer debt, the relative difficulty, the relative risk of investing in business debt changes. And when you invest in business debt, you're actually promoting growth, you're creating jobs, you're doing all those wondrous things that we rely on capitalism to do. And yet, when you start to do this, when you start to create ways to make it easier to invest in consumer debt, it begins to crowd out business debt. Now, if you were in an Econ 101 class, you would hear a lot about how government debt crowds out business debt. Well, historians like to look at things as they actually are. And this is one of the virtues of humanities. We actually go into businesses, we go and look at bank statements, and you look at banking records. Well, where are banks actually putting their money? Well, it turns out they're not deciding between government debt and business debt. They're deciding between consumer debt and business debt. And so as banks makes it easier and easier for them to invest in this, it crowds out investments into small, especially small and mid-sized businesses, not GE. GE is fine, don't worry about GE. But this is a process by which this crowds out these kinds of jobs, businesses, so they're harder for those kinds of companies to grow. When you can't grow, it creates fewer jobs, which creates demand for more debt, which in turn allows these kinds of organizations to sell this debt onto markets. And so this process feeds on itself, begins to spiral out of control, feeding on itself. And instead of doubling down on the policies of the New Deal, which I'm going to come to in a second, that we had created in the 1930s and 40s and 50s to contain instability, to promote stability, to promote investment in jobs and in businesses, we embraced a fantasy world of gnomes, a fantasy world of free markets. Now, of course, the economy changed. Capitalism is a permanent revolution, but policies need to change as well. What you don't do is turn to the gnomes. And in the 1970s, we stopped being able to pay back what we borrow. This is what changed in the 70s, not just our morality. We didn't all become swingers. It became the case that the 1%, which had paid the 99%, all those good wages, no longer did so. The 1% got bigger, and then instead of paying people money, they just lent them money. They lent them money instead of investing in businesses. Now, it's okay to have inequality as long as that money gets, this is the compact we have, that money gets invested in businesses so that jobs are created, so wages go up. But instead, it's invested in all these kinds of shenanigans. Debt becomes a way to invest all that money, creating slower and slower growth. Now, as you begin to bypass all those bank deposits, as you begin to have global capital markets, it's not just small-town banks that invest. It's union pension funds and European small towns, all buying these American mortgages in the 70s, and then American credit card debts in the 80s, and lending on houses as there is a global appetite for these kinds of investments become easier than ever before. Securitization, especially consumer securitization, crowds out business debt, which is in fact never securitized. And so where does this all come from? It comes from policymakers in the 60s and 70s confusing the cause of prosperity, that is good jobs, with its symptom, which is home ownership. And for 40 years, we've kept doing the same, finding new ways to pile on more credit while doing very little to put it into small business growth, especially in the cities that initially were the aim of such policies. As a society, we've made it too easy to invest in consumer debt. Now, the largest corporations can borrow as much as they want, and sexy tech companies can sell stock, but everything else is just left to grow at an anemic pace, funded out of their own earnings and sometimes their own credit cards. Now, this is a pretty dark vision, but we have answers for it as historians. Since the New Deal, we created policies that addressed exactly these kinds of issues. These kinds of policies that worked together between government and business were the foundation of that post-war prosperity. Now, many Americans associate the New Deal with direct federal spending, but its real innovation, the amazing innovation of the New Deal, was not in building one-off stadiums, was not in doing the CCC, building trails to God knows where. It's about channeling private capital into public enterprises. All the banks in the 30s sat on these big piles of cash like Scrooge McDuck and had no idea where to put that money until the government intervened. While we remember the New Deal as the origin of the welfare state, we really should understand it as the origin of the insurance state, because it was the government's creation of policies that ensured private capital investment into industrial development that made all the difference. The Federal Housing Administration brought suburban housing to tenement dwellers. The Rural Electrification Administration brought electricity to farmers, kicking off an incredible boom in productivity. The Defense Plant Corporation encouraged investment in aerospace and electronics, fields that had been possible technically but had languished because their development was too risky. Across any number of areas that we think of as the cornerstone industrial developments of the post-war era, the government was involved. Not by spending $1 of taxpayer money, but by just creating insurance levers to channel capital into these areas, turning the best parts of the human imagination of science into an American reality of prosperity. Take, for instance, the Defense Plant Corporation. Now, I always hear from students who like to tell me that the Great Depression was ended by World War II. They like to tell me that, and then they usually tell me about things they watch from the History Channel. And I know nothing about guns. What I do know about is how guns are made, and most importantly, how guns are financed. The Defense Plant Corporation was an amazing vehicle to channel private capital into the aerospace industry. It ensured all those loans to enable us to build an entire industry almost overnight. Before the war, there was almost no aerospace industry in America. After the war, it was 4 times larger than the pre-war auto industry. This is an amazing transformation in just a few years. Now, the war legitimated this policy, making it politically possible, but what made it work was not the war at all. After the war, we continued to make planes for domestic use. Now, we created all these airfields. What made it possible was this use of insurance policies to channel capital into technologically possible, yet unrealized industries. And I like to talk about it because no one has ever heard of this. You've all heard of the FHA, but the DPC is completely forgotten. yet it's at the foundation of nearly our entire economy. Now, what does this all mean? It means that in the last 40 years, at the end of the post-war period, this virtuous cycle of investment was broken. Capitalism changed, but instead of adapting, we changed the rules that promoted not investment in technological progress, but in technological stagnation. Now, what's nice about this is that it's not about fixing immoral people. In fact, that would be extraordinarily difficult, right? Actually fixing human nature, that would be difficult. But changing rules about things like insurance on loans, we can do that tomorrow if we really wanted to. It's about creating rules that bring order and stability to our financial system so that the real work of making real things for real people, like we did before, can happen again. And I return to the question that I asked at the beginning. What has changed? The main thing is that we know how to fix this. We have the lessons of history. We've done it before, and we can do it again. It's not just enough about saying no to a few greedy bankers and putting them in jail and hoping for the best. We need to fix the entire system, not to punish capitalists, but to help them against their own, perhaps, insights about how things ought to work, help them actually make money, and in the process, create jobs and wages. It's not just enough to stop what's not working. We also have to implement what really works so that we can bring back prosperity, so that the gnomes can work for us and not us for the gnomes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, I wanted to thank you so much for bridging the gap between economics, where I come from, and the humanities, making it so interesting. My question briefly is, in recent years, the Obama administration, President Obama has attempted to invest in alternative energy. Would those types of investment be the kind of thing with the defense plan? And it wasn't only in aeronautics, it was the whole aluminum industries. It was a lot of different industries in the 1940s. Is alternative energy an avenue for us to proceed in that direction now?
Yeah, obviously, lots of those investments have turned out poorly in the last few years. I mean, I think that's the crisis, right? Like, how do we figure out what actually is a good place to put our money? And the answer is you don't trust the people who run the DMV to decide that. You don't trust government bureaucrats to decide that. You let private lenders, and you help them make the choices into those areas so they can make the choices. Now, in this period, initially they tried to support a variety. You mentioned aluminum extraction, not just Alcoa, but other kinds of extractive corporations. But eventually, it all consolidated back to Alcoa, and they were comfortable with that. They reinforced monopoly in the economy, but it brought progress in a lot of ways. And it was also not just in aluminum or aerospace, it was in areas like synthetic rubber, so that it addressed certain kinds of strategic issues in the economy during the war, that instead of having to import rubber from Asia, we could actually just produce it ourselves chemically. But yeah, I think things like that, things like green technology would be a good example of this, where there's a lot of possibility, and yet we're not going fast enough to actually address the needs. There's a lot of pushback against it from, from companies that perhaps are threatened by green technology. Now, there was a lot of pushback from the horse and buggy crowd when cars were invented too, yet somehow we managed to survive that eclipse. I mean, the people who are most gung-ho about free markets are also often so obsessed with the frailty of capitalism and progress that it's stunning to me. Places like Flint, Michigan, for instance, the reason why Flint, Michigan became a car capital was that it was a capital of the horse and buggy trade. That's why GM went there, because William Durant, who was the founder of GM, he was a salesman. He didn't know how to build anything. He went there and he subcontracted out to people. So we can transform communities. We can build on our strengths. I think it's possible. Now, are there hiccups? Yeah, there's hiccups. But in the long run, we need to have other kinds of energy. Yeah.
Can you comment on the role that blaming the debtors is playing in sort of misguided austerity policies here and in Europe? How much is it being driven by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people always want more stuff. I want more stuff. If we're going to make universal claims about human nature, is that we're acquisitive, unless it's ice cream and it's over several gallons, right? I mean, eventually you don't want more and more stuff. But I think that the reason why it got out of hand in a lot of ways, beginning in the 90s, was that people trusted, if you went in to borrow money, you believed that they wouldn't give you the money if you weren't good for it, right? That you would think, well, why would they give me $200,000 if I couldn't pay this back? And they know better than I do, right? We can't expect our entire society to be financial experts. That's unreasonable, just like we can't expect our entire society to be anything, to be auto mechanics or historians or painters or anything. We have division of labor. And this is one of those areas where borrowers trusted lenders. Now, what they didn't know was that by the 1990s, these same lenders had developed risk models. So they were able to figure out that, well, if I lend this money, maybe 90% or 95% will pay me back. But that other fraction, the fraction that won't, well, I'll make it up by just raising interest rates on everybody else. And yet, for that 5 or 10%, or even 1%, or 0.1%, it ruined their entire lives. And for me, part of it is saying, well, how do we maintain this system of lending money without destroying lives? And obviously, there's a role for debt in the economy. In the post-war, it was used very well to borrow for houses, to borrow for Big Fin Cadillacs, to borrow at the new Bloomingdale's branch store. But it didn't destroy everything. And it was because it was limited. And the expectation was you don't lend to people excessively. And so I think we need to bring that back into the conversation. Yeah.
Could you talk for a minute about the crisis of the junk bond and derivative market?
In the 80s or the contemporary?
I never fully understood the derivative market.
Yeah, and me neither. I don't think anybody does. Well, the idea, what's interesting to me about the derivative market and the junk bond market is that derivatives and bonds in general were kind of a dying field at the end of the 1960s. S&P, one of the credit rating agencies, almost went out of business because there was so little to do. It was such a straightforward kind of situation. The same people issued bonds all the time. There weren't that many financial instruments to really deal with. And yet what happens is that at the end of the Bretton Woods system, something that historians never want to talk about because it's too esoteric, it seems, it brought us back off the gold standard, and it brought back all kinds of volatility to our currency and then into many other areas. And it's in this moment of volatility that derivatives come back into the economy. Nearly everything you see in the 70s existed in the 1920s. Zero coupon bonds and everything like that. All the things that are fancy, you can see them in the 20s. For the most part, not everything. Collateralized mortgage obligations did not exist. But these kinds of things emerge in response to the volatility of the economy. That's why they expand. And when they expand, all this energy goes into them. The smartest people in the world go and make nothing. It's a tremendous brain drain into this area that makes a lot of money. And if you were smart, if I had been smarter, I would have done that too. But but I'm happy to be in the humanities. It's good to be in the humanities. To talk about this stuff, and it's rewarding and stuff. I pay my mortgage, it's fine. But the smartest people went into this. And instead of focusing on technology and really advancing science, we spent all this time and effort investing in things that are not real at all. And we feel like we live in a period of tremendous technological change. Now, the economists in the crowd will know what I'm talking about when I refer to the work of Tyler Cowen, who in the last few years has really talked about this, that all the technological change that we're living through is really very epiphenomenal compared to the pace of change, right? In the end of the 1960s, you had the internet, right? The origins of the internet. You had the origins of cell phones. You had computers. You had cars. You had all kinds of things that we think are whiz-bang inventions. But really all we're living through is the refinement of these technologies. This is nothing compared to 50 years before that. 50 years before 1960 was 1910. The world of 1910 barely had automobiles, didn't have planes, didn't have, aluminum was still used. It was so expensive that rich people gilded their ceilings with it like gold. None of these things existed. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about stagnation and the misuse of talent. So I realize I strayed a little bit away from derivatives and junk bonds, but if you're asking me what the importance of them is, rather than how they work, which is a technical issue that I don't think you or I really care about, what we really care about is what they mean. This is where the humanities are good, because you don't get bogged down in these silly technical details. What do they mean? They mean that our economy went totally off the rails. Next question. Yeah, up in the back.
Yeah, two kind of related sub-questions. One is, I wonder if you've looked into or thought about Frank Knight's 100% money movement as a solution to the Depression. They're called for getting off of debt-based money. Related to that, I've been reading some ecological economists who talk about the financial crisis is an example of what happens when an infinite planet financial system based on fractional reserve banking runs into the limits of a finite planet.
Yeah, so the first question is basically, should we go back on the gold standard? No.
They weren't about the gold standard at all.
I haven't read this particular book. Okay.
Get off of fractional reserve banking, which creates money by creating debt at the same time.
100% reserves.
100% reserves. Well, I think that's just a question of the money supply. I mean, I think the money, it's good to have some inflation, and some inflation forces you to invest your money. And so no, I'm not one of these people who thinks that we need to adjust those kinds of things. I think that it's not a question of going back to the social credit movement. This is very similar, it sounds to me, like the social credit movement of the 19th century or Henry George or something like that. But I think what's important is to realize it's about where we put our money and creating policies that address those kinds of issues. I haven't read the particular book, so I don't like to talk about things I don't know about. Yeah. Any other? There were so many questions up here. Yeah. A gentleman of my persuasion.
Can you talk a little bit about the consumer society, really from the movie last night, part of this double indemnity, who saw a grocery store that from the 30s, which had a lot of products, but it's nothing like
No.
60s or today. And debt. It seems to be symbiotic.
No, certainly. We live in amazing times where you could get almost anything from anywhere in the world. And it's not just about debt, it's about logistics. It's about the sort of reemergence of a global economy that had collapsed in the years up to World War I. Now, what makes it possible in the long run to sustain that kind of economy, the incredible prosperity of the post-war economy, is our wages, though. And what makes wages possible, the growth of wages in the long run, is the ability of industries to continue to make profits. The profits go up, and this is made possible by new places to invest. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, this is not a radical idea. You'll learn this in any sort of marketing class, that whenever you have a product, you make profits at the beginning, and eventually over time, the profits fall. This happens for every kind of product that you make. And so we search out newer and newer products to be made. This is part of why there's a proliferation of products. But we haven't actually produced that many new products. There's some new products in the last few years, like the iPhone or something that people like to focus on. Well, or Google or something like that. And I have a slide that we could look at real quick. You know, that there's this idea that our economy is really focused on these high-tech goods and in terms of producing the iPhone and things like that. But when you look at how many jobs this actually creates, it's very few. So that more people, you know, nearly 10 times as many people work at Sears as work at Google. Right? So Google's great. I love Google. I've I know people work at Google. I'm happy they have jobs. I use it all the time. But Sears is what matters for the economy. GM is what matters for the economy. And when you look at stuff like that, and you think, well, what does it mean to have all these kinds of new products? You realize, well, there aren't that many new products to be had because we're not actually technologically innovating. And can I look at another slide real fast? Is that OK with you? Okay. For me, this all comes back to this slide, which is the other 1% we don't talk about, which is the less than 1% of the federal budget that's invested in basic scientific research. Now, as a humanities person, I can't get NSF or NIH starting to get into that. But it's nothing like what we had in the post-war in terms of creating new kinds of real technologies that allow the economy to be at the top of this curve, that allow it to grow over time. Now, the gentleman in the back is thinking about this in terms of environmental issues. Well, I would argue that a lot of the technologies we're developing, that we could develop, might be less energy intensive, might be less material intensive. You know, if we build a lot of silicon, there's a lot of silicon to be had. It's not deep underground. It's right there on the surface. It's in deserts. And we can just pick it up and use it. So there's a lot of opportunities here that, but I'm not a scientist. If I were somebody else, I would be a scientist because that would be really important. But that scientists are the ones that really drive this possible change. Yeah, in the back. Well, I think one of my main arguments is that the inequality is one of the causes of the financial crisis. So we're in agreement there. I think you need to have growth, but you need to have balanced growth. You know? And so if you, at the beginning of my talk, I can't do it. It's too much. At the beginning of my talk, you know, I was talking about these. I'm going to stop. At the beginning of the talk, I was talking about this, that the way in which distribution in the post-war was very different. In the books, I write a lot about this, that the top marginal tax rate in the 1950s was about 93%. 93% of every additional dollar, right? So we might agree that that seems really high, but it also is a time when we think of, well, capitalism is working. This is a time when it was working for many, like most Americans, right? Not all Americans, but a lot of them. And so, you know, let's put there's a number between 35% and 93% where maybe that would work better. But part of the reason why it worked better was that when that money was taxed, it was also money that would be turned into and invested in things that produce growth, which no longer is the case. And so I think it's not just about seeing a zero-sum game, but understanding that capitalism, unless it no longer works, you know, which obviously there are those in the extreme left that think that, and have thought that for about 150 years, you know, it actually works best when there is money going to people at the bottom, because then they can buy things. Then it's just about creating a system where those are able to buy the products that they make. And so it's not a radical thing. It's just returning to this post-war vision of the economy, which was centered on growth, which was centered on balance. And so I don't think it's growth or distribution. I actually think that growth requires distribution. These things are deeply connected. And it's that sort of centrist vision that will be most palatable to people. Yeah. Well, I think right now we're just trying to balance the ship, right? The ship's gone wildly out of whack, right? So at the point at which we're no longer having people in charge of air tower to like make sure the planes land correctly, things have gotten way off track, okay? So, I mean, I think we should raise taxes to make sure that our planes land safely. I don't think that's a crazy idea. But Yeah, including where I live. So I think that it's important to realize that it's not just about taxing, it's about what we do with those taxes, right? If we're just digging holes and filling holes and digging holes and filling holes, that's a stupid way to spend money, right? Bridges to nowhere are a stupid way to spend money. However, I think funding science is a good way to spend money. I think making sure that our power, right now, it's not easy to move power from the southwest to the northeast. There are connections that can be made, but the real obstacle to having just fields and fields of solar collectors powering a huge fraction of our economy is that no one can agree on who's going to pay for it. Who's going to pay for the distribution network? Well, in my mind, it's simple. Why don't we pay for it? I'm cool with that. Are you cool with that? Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. It'll create lots of jobs, high-tech jobs, low-tech jobs, you know, creating jobs not just for the smartest, but for average folks. Somebody's put a sign that says, "Are you ready?" Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready for having a distribution of electricity in America that works. Now, you can't just in every country. It's, you know, England can't move energy from its deserts, right? It's a little island in the middle of nowhere. But we're lucky enough to have a huge area of our country that can do this. So let's do it. Let's not dig holes to nowhere, bridges to nowhere. So it's not this either or. Do you believe in taxes or you don't believe in taxes? Do you believe in the market or you don't believe in the market, right? That's for children. Children think this way. And adults think, think about the world as, well, how is this really going to work on the ground? You know, you can have private investment in green technology, like we were talking about before, investment that says, well, let's do this, and then create, and maybe that part is private, and then the public part is the network. It seems like there's a lot of ways we can do all kinds of things like this, right? So anyway, other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, and I'll be around afterwards.